Before we get to the Bud Collins stories, just want to get your quick take on the big news yesterday with Wimbledon being canceled. What were your thoughts?
Well, thanks, Stephen. And you are the wise man, as Bud Collins would say, along with Tracer and my great friend Jimmy Arias. And it's being in New York is a little like being under siege right now. And you guys have done such an incredible job at bringing the entertainment and the distraction to us. So good for you guys. And as far as Wimbledon, it's such sad news, but it was not unexpected. I'm thrilled for Simona Halep because she gets 2 years as the defending champion. Robert Farah and Juan Sebastian Cabal, they get the same thing. They get to say they're the defending champion. And how about Feliciano Lopez next year when he goes back to play Queen's Club as the defending champion in singles and doubles? He'll be almost 40 years old. So there definitely are bright sides. My little bit of breaking news for you guys. You were mentioning the Bryan brothers and how they've said no matter what, this is it. Well, I've been texting back and forth with Bob over the last few days. And I just texted back and forth a few minutes ago and I said, well, really? He said, look, we're going to see if we get to play on the hard courts this year. We really wanted to play the Olympics. Obviously, 3-time champions at Wimbledon, they want to play there. He said, well, we might pick some select tournaments next year. We're just going to see if we get on the hard courts. It might be a nice way to go out at the U.S. Open. If all of those hard court tournaments go by the wayside, I suspect we'll see them in 2021 at Wimbledon and at the Olympics.
Okay, so breaking news here on Tennis Channel, the Bryan brothers, it may not be the end of the run in 2020. They could come back next year, Wimbledon, the Olympics, and that is if they can't play the U.S. Open this year. But if they play the U.S. Open this year, they'll call it?
The way they're talking about it is if they can play the whole hard court season. So if it's only the U.S. Open, then they might think about playing again next year. They're really taking it. They're saying we're waiting to see what the dust settles and how we feel when all this is over. I think everybody is so up in the air about everything going on in tennis right now. Nobody really wants to commit. He ended it by saying to me, I'm sorry, we can't be a little bit more committal.
Well, that's some good news. Maybe the Bryans will definitely get to see them. But Cindy, you were so young when you got involved in tennis. How did you meet Bud, and how did you get to know him and spend so much time with him?
You know, Tracer, I was so lucky. And by the way, just so you know, I too have my signed book from Bud, just as you do. I have a tie that actually belongs to my son who sang at Bud's memorial service a few years ago. And you and I met back then, too, in 1979. I was a summer intern at World Tennis Magazine, and it was Bud who invited me to the patio outside then Louis Armstrong Stadium. This was before the court was covered. And we had picnics out there every day, and people would bring in food. And Bud just gathered this group together and said, come on, let's go. And he never really took no for an answer. And it wasn't just so much the knowing his knowledge of the game. It was that he was willing to spill that knowledge everywhere. And he really gathered his troops together. And he had interns every year. He would call them aides de camp. And they were kids from Harvard. And they would be the people who ran around gathering all the information, because Bud was all of the knowledge before there was an internet to go look it up on. You go to Bud.
Was Shmerls, was Bud a mentor to you in some ways, because you started as a writer, then you went to TV the same way he did? I'm not sure you ever went with the outfits, the colorful outfits when you were on TV like he did.
No, I like Hillary Clinton wears 7 black pantsuits, but I love Bud's outfits. Here's what I would say about him. When everybody was looking down the right side or looking to the forehand, Bud was sprinting to the backhand. He never looked for the same story that anybody else was looking for. So he would grab me and he would walk into the press room at either Wimbledon or the U.S. Open, where I was lucky enough to cover Wimbledon with him for the Boston Globe. And he would say, I'm going out to see Peridorn Srishavhan from Thailand. You take the rest of the field. And you'd look up, it was the busiest day at Wimbledon. There were 30 stories to write, but he was looking for the road less traveled. And I remember at the U.S. Open one year, it was 2006, and he wanted to go see a 17-year-old player, Aga Radwanska. And she was way out on a far court, and she'd reached the round of 16 at Wimbledon, but nobody in the U.S. had any idea who she was. So Bud grabbed my hand and said, come on, let's go. And we ran out there, and we interviewed her father, and we interviewed her sister Ursula, and lo and behold, a few years later, Radwanska was number 2 in the world. He had this uncanny ability to spot the story that nobody else saw.
You know, Shmerls, I first started commentating the first time I ever did it, first time I was on the air, it was with you. And you sort of helped me out from an English standpoint. You knew that I'd only gone to school till 8th grade. Actually, I did finish my high school diploma, but it was not real in some ways. Did Bud ever help you the way you helped me as far as getting to the commentating side of things and giving you advice?
Well, Jimmy, you're very kind, and working with you was such a pleasure because you would walk into the booth. I'd been prepping for 2 hours. You would walk in and say, "Who's playing?" And then I remember you put a top ticker on top of our top monitor.
I still do that, by the way, Shmerls.
Yeah, great. So I couldn't see what was going on live from the event because you'd have the stock ticker going up top there. But working with you was so much fun because you, like Bud, had this uncanny ability to tell stories, to unabashedly bash your fellow players. You never held back, but you did so with a sense of humor and a kindness, and you continue to do that. And that's what Bud was like. He was never there to hurt anybody. And there were those moments when inadvertently or inexplicably we would hurt a player by writing something that they didn't want us to write. And we hurt James Blake once, and James was very unhappy. We had told the story of his father and his bout with cancer, and James didn't want that revealed. So Bud and I went back into the locker room with James, and we both stood there and we apologized to James. And it was a long time before we ever forgot players are human beings, and there are sides that they do want told, and there are sides that they don't. And there are times when a reporter has to tell the full story. And Bud knew how to walk that line like nobody else I've ever met. And so I learned from him on a daily basis, just sitting next to him, just watching him work, watching him on deadline, watching him answer the phones. And he would take me into interviews and he'd show me, how do you ask a question without insulting somebody and with being tough enough that you actually got the answer that you needed to get.
Yeah, talking about sitting next to Bud, Cindy, I'm sure you had the opportunity to sit in the press box, maybe at Armstrong, maybe it was at Wimbledon, and he was so knowledgeable about the game. He had such great quips. What was it like to sit next to him during a match? Was he analyzing the game? Was he being funny, or was he just focused?
Well, Trace, I have a funny story to tell you, and it refers back to something you said a little while ago about Fingers Fortescue. You know, we all knew that Bud had nicknames for everything. But remember when 4 players would come to the net and 2 of them would be volleying back and forth, and most people would say, well, it's a volley exchange, and Bud would go, eyeball to eyeball. However, he talked about his Uncle Studley, and he talked about Fingers Fortescue. Well, he made up those names. We thought they were complete fabrications from the Bud tale of lore. However, Fortescue was actually the middle name of Herbert Lawford, the #1 player from Scotland who actually won Wimbledon in 1887. So he would pull these things out, but you knew they were all finely molded from fact. And that was what was so much fun. And yes, he would do a play-by-play of 2 people playing at the Longwood Cricket Club. He took me there once, and that was where I first met him and got to know him. And he said, you're going to play on grass. And he threw me onto the grass courts with Edie McGoldrick, a former pro player. I'd never been on grass in my life, and I was a middling player to begin with. And Bud would stand at the side of the court, and he would do a play-by-play. Then he would get on the court in his bare feet and play. And remember, Bud Coyne did all of these things. He started the press tournaments so that at these tournaments, press felt like they were important. And they happened at Longwood, and they happened in Hilton Head. And truth to tell, I still have the spittoon, which was the trophy that Bud gave, because that's what he did back then. Everything was whimsy and everything was farcical to him. And it meant everything because it made the press feel like they were an integral part of this sport, which I don't think we were in the very beginning.
Cindy, we've heard so many great stories about Bud Collins, so many wonderful characteristics. What do you think is one characteristic about him that doesn't get told enough?
Oh, I can tell you in a nutshell, his humility and his quietness. Everybody thinks of Bud as bombastic and gregarious and outgoing, and that's the way he was in public. But when he would take a group of his closest friends, and we would be sitting at either Santa Croce in London, the Wimbledon hangout, or Lusardi's restaurant in New York City, Bud would be the quiet one. You would barely hear him speak. And you know why? Because he was listening and he was trying to take in what everybody else was saying. And he had this way of being able to embrace everybody in a room. My dear friend Leslie Visser and I used to fight over who got to sit next to Bud at every single dinner. And his second wife, Mary Lou, would say, you do it. And then Anita, who came in and was so wonderful, Anita would say, okay, girls, you can have Bud now. But I really think it was his ability to listen more than speak that differentiates him.